Use this video only as a guide in preparation to installing Wilwood Aero4 and Aero6 brake kits on 2005 to 2010 Chrysler 300C, Dodge Challenger, Charger, and Magnum vehicles. Please follow all Wilwood instructions. Start by lining up the 12 holes in the rotor with the 12 holes in the mounting hats. Apply some red Loctite to the bolts. Wilwood recommends Loctite 271. Run these in by hand and then snug them up for now. We will torque them to spec later. Wilwood recommends only using an inch-pound torque wrench for this, not a foot-pound torque wrench. It may also be helpful to number the holes in the rotor with a 1 at 1 o'clock, 2 at 6 o'clock, 3 at 3 o'clock, 4 at 9 o'clock, and so on. You want to tighten these in small increments until you reach the torque spec in a crisscross pattern. When you're ready to torque, make sure your torque wrench is set correctly and lock her down. I will not be trying to teach you how to safety wire because I'm no professional at it. This was my first time doing it. I will, however, leave a few links in the description to some very good videos that detail the process. I will also leave a link to the safety wire pliers that I purchased to do this job. Just watch the videos a few times, do a few practice runs, and you should be able to get this. I would recommend wearing some kind of protective glove while doing this because the stainless steel wire can wreak havoc on your fingertips. I'll leave a link in the description to some gloves similar to what I have here. Once finished, you should have something that looks similar to this. Just make sure all your wire is nice and taut and there are no sharp edges sticking out to get you. I started by removing the hard line from the rubber line here at the frame, and then the retaining clip, and finally I plugged the hard line with a rubber cap. Next, remove the ABS line from the brake line bracket, and then remove the bracket using a 10mm socket. Now remove the two 18mm caliper mounting bolts. and remove the caliper. Then off with the stock rotors. Remove the dust shield either by removing the hub first, or, as I elected to do here since I'm not going to reuse it, by cutting a small section out. If you cut a few inches out of it and then unbolt it, it will slide right off from behind the hub. Now clean and degrease the mounting surfaces and the surrounding areas. Get your bolts, washers, and the recommended shims together. Insert the bolts with washers through the holes in the knuckle. Install the recommended shims. Be sure you have the same amount of shims on each bolt. And then thread the bolts into the mounting bracket. Now just snug it up fairly tight. We're not torquing it yet, but we don't want it to move. Wilwood calls this the rotor registration ring. It's basically like a hub-centric ring for the rotor. Just make sure that this small side is facing out. It just slides right over the hub. And now install that big, beautiful rotor. Tighten it up with at least 3 lug nuts. Make sure she spins. Now here on the back side, the lower mounting boss for the dust shield. You want to take a good look at that. Wilwood recommends 50 thousandths clearance minimum. If you have less than that, as we did here, you're going to have to remove a little material. As you can see, it's pretty close down in there. We're going to have to take some off of this guy right here. Get your angle grinder out and let a few sparks fly. Once finished, clean it up with a file. And then you may want to vacuum to clean the area of any metal debris. You may want to apply some paint to any unpainted surfaces to prevent rust. And then go ahead and reinstall the rotor. Check for clearance. We're looking good now. Install these spacers and the recommended shims, and be sure to lube up the mounting studs with light motor oil. Install your caliper. Make sure the large cylinder is at the top or at the exit of the rotor. And tighten down the lock nuts. Looking from above, you want to make sure the caliper is centered over the rotor. You can use a filler gauge here for a little more accuracy. You will either add or remove shims here, depending on which way you need to move the caliper. Once you have it centered, add red Loctite to these bolts and torque to spec. To install the brake pads, you're going to remove these small little retaining clips first and then remove the retaining pin. Then drop in the pads. They simply slide right in. Then reinstall your retaining pins. And finally, the retaining clips. Now make sure your retaining clip is seating nicely in that groove. There's a small groove that it seats in. Make sure that's in there good. You don't want that coming out. You may want to take a small flathead screwdriver and gently press down on the clip to make sure that it is properly seated. You want to check that your pads are even with the top of the rotor. In our case, with the recommended shims, they were a little high. So we will be removing these shims from the top and bottom stud. With no shims and only the spacer, ours lined up pretty good. There's a chamfered edge on the outside diameter of the rotor, and our pads lined up almost perfectly with that chamfered edge, just below the outside diameter of the rotor. Install your wheels and check for clearance. Bend this tab slightly to remove the stock brake line from the bracket. Now here is the Wilwood brake lines installed. They went on without issue. Be sure to use Teflon tape on the 90-degree fitting at the caliper because it is pipe thread. I started by removing the stock brake line. Be sure you have something to catch the brake fluid. I do have a pan under there. It's out of shot, so you can't see it, but it is there catching the brake fluid. And you can go ahead and just remove this line altogether now if you want. Here's where some swivel sockets come in handy. You're going to remove the two 18mm caliper mounting bolts. It's a little busy back here, but you can get to it with an extension and the swivel sockets. Once those are removed, you can remove that little caliper. And then that stock rotor. She's got to go. Run into a little problem on the rear caliper mounting bracket. The instructions say to reuse the factory caliper mounting bolts, which that's no problem. They're a good 10.9 bolt with a nice washer bit on them. The problem is, this is 12 by 1.75, just like the front bolts that Wilwood supplied, but that will not go through there. We'll have to drill this one out to accept this bolt, and hopefully that should work. Can't use a smaller bolt because the rear knuckle or upright is this thread, so 12 by 1.75. So we got to drill this out so it's a through fit. Go through there and tighten up with the knuckle. Shouldn't be too bad.
Okay, this bolt, 12 millimeter, we're supposed to reuse it in this bracket, but the holes are too small. So we got to ream the holes to fit this bolt. We started out with a 1/2 inch hole, which equals 12.7 millimeters. It's okay, a little loose. We went down incrementally 2 more sizes in 64ths of an inch. 31/64, okay. Then we went to 30/64, perfection. That's what we'll do. That's smooth.
Nice.
In our previous test, we drilled a number of holes, decreasing in size by 1/64 each. We determined that 30/64 was the correct size. It fit perfectly with the bolts. Okay. Now, we used the 30/64 to ream the hole in the bracket, and we just want to be sure that what we did here transfers to this, and it is the same. Perfection.
With all 4 holes reamed to the proper size, we can install the rear caliper mounting brackets. If you'll notice right there, we've got some shims under that head of that bolt. I'll show you why those are there in a second. Go ahead and run these up and snug them up tight. Add some oil to the studs. Install the rotor and the adapter ring and snug it up with a few lug nuts. Now, if you notice here, we are very close on this backing plate. Actually, I think it's touching in a few spots. This is a quick fix though. You can take a plastic wedge, a trim removal tool or something similar, and slide it in between the rotor and the backing plate and bend that back pretty easily. Now, the shims I showed you under the head of the washer earlier, here's why those are there. Those 2 bolts right there, the caliper mounting bolts, they go all the way through. Without those shims in there, they actually go all the way through and they can touch that hat. We don't want that. So be careful with that. Look for it, make sure they're not touching. Add the appropriate amount of shims under the bolt, under the head of the bolt, and you should be good. And here's where we bent back the backing plate. We've got plenty of clearance now. Slide your caliper on. Snug it up with the lock nuts. And just like the front, we want to make sure the caliper is centered over the rotor. You can use a feeler gauge here again for a little more accuracy. Depending on which way you need to go, you will either add or remove shims from between the caliper mounting bracket and the knuckle. Once you get it where you want it, torque these to spec. Both front and rear brake pads are the same, so the procedure is the same as well. Reinstall the caliper. Snug it up again with the lock nuts. just like the front, we want those pads to be right there at the edge of that chamfer on the outside diameter of the rotor. Add or remove shims here, depending on which way you need to go. Just make sure you add the same amount of shims on both top and bottom stud. Once it's where you want it, torque the lock nuts. Seeing as how every car is a little different, be prepared to bend, manipulate, or relocate the mounting bracket to achieve the desired fitment. As you can see, it's a little tight back here, so take your time and make sure everything clears. Here you can see we've had to relocate this bracket slightly. There's the stock mounting location. We moved it back a few inches and straightened out the bracket to get the line to come under the sway bar. Remember, we're looking at this with the suspension at full droop, and you're rarely going to be at that position, so it's a good idea to put a jack under the lower control arm and move the suspension through its range of motion. You want to make sure you don't have any excessive bends, the line's not pinched anywhere or rubbing. Here you see we are just barely touching on that control arm. We address that by adding a piece of silicone hose over the brake line for some added protection. Once everything's torqued, all the lines connected, you will need to bleed the brake system. You will need an assistant for this, one person in the car pumping the brakes, one opening the bleed screw until there's no air left in the system. These calipers take a tiny 1/4 inch wrench on the bleed screw. £34.6 pounds for the stock caliper and rotor setup. 27.6 for the Wilwood. That's 14 pounds off the front of the vehicle. 24.4 for the rear stock. And 26.2 for the rear Wilwoods. So that's about a 10-pound total weight savings. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it's a win-win in my book because you're gaining a lot in the braking capabilities and you're losing 10 pounds on top of that. And you're losing 14 pounds off the front of the vehicle where it's needed the most. The install went pretty smooth other than the rear brackets needing to be reamed out. That wasn't too hard to do, but to be honest, I was a little disappointed that we had to do that. Didn't really expect that with a name like Wilwood, but then again, this kit covers a wide range of vehicles, so I guess you can't be prepared for everything. Overall, this is really nice stuff from Wilwood. Follow Wilwood's bedding in procedure the best you can. Be aware that these brakes may be a little noisy until they are bedded in, but once bedded in properly, you should have nice, quiet, smooth operation. Now go out and enjoy your new brakes.